Preventing and reducing aggressive behavior. The research discussed so far has made it abundantly clear that aggressive behavior is rife in many areas of social life and brings misery and long-term suffering to large numbers of people. In addition, the economic costs of aggression and violence for health services, the labor market, and the criminal justice system are immense. Therefore, exploring effective ways to prevent and reduce aggressive behavior is a pressing task. The research brought together in this volume has accumulated a large body of knowledge that can be used to design strategies for prevention, grounded in theory and based on empirical evidence. This chapter offers a selective overview of approaches designed to tackle the task of reducing aggression and violence. To systematize the large literature, it may be helpful to distinguish between general approaches and specific approaches. General approaches seek to influence processes involved in many different forms of aggressive behavior, such as promoting self-regulation or reducing realistic intergroup conflict by achieving a more equitable distribution of scarce resources. Specific approaches are custom-tailored to address particular forms of aggressive behavior, such as sexual abuse of children or bullying in the workplace. Within each of the two categories, a further broad distinction can be made between measures that target the individual person and measures that are implemented at the societal level. Table 12.1 illustrates these classifications. In the first part of this chapter, we examine general strategies for reducing aggression that are implemented at the societal level or directed at the individual person. In addition to strategies that have been shown to be successful in reducing aggression, we also take a critical look at approaches that, despite their common sense appeal and popularity in everyday discourse, have been demonstrated to be ineffective or even counterproductive. In the second part of the chapter, examples of prevention and intervention efforts to tackle specific forms of aggression, such as gang violence, family aggression, and sexual aggression, will be discussed. This part complements the discussion of prevention approaches in the earlier chapters, for example, in relation to the use of violent media, Chapter 6, bullying, workplace aggression, and aggressive driving, Chapter 7, and terrorism, Chapter 11. General strategies for preventing and reducing aggression. Theories of aggression specify the mechanisms by which aggressive behavior is elicited and maintained, both in the course of individual development and in the immediate situation. See Chapter 2. By implication, these theories also provide a basis for developing strategies to prevent and modify aggressive behavior. Meyer and Wilkowski, 2013. For example, the theoretical assumption and empirical evidence that aggression is the result of angry arousal suggests that aggressive behavior may be reduced by promoting anger control. Explaining aggression as a response to the observation of aggressive behavioral models suggests that keeping children and adolescents away from violent media content may be effective in reducing aggression. In the present section, general prevention strategies such as these are discussed that are applicable to many manifestations of aggressive behaviors. We begin by looking at strategies implemented at the societal level, and then move on to measures targeting the individual to ask what the evidence has to say about the effectiveness. Table 12.1, Approaches to Prevention, Illustrative Examples. So you have the scope and level of implementation, either the individual or the society community. So with the general scope, in terms of the individual, you have anger management, eliciting incompatible responses, and modeling and reinforcement. And at the society community level, you have capital punishment, gun control, and alcohol restrictions. And when the scope is domain specific, for gang violence, for the individual, you have training effective refusal skills, and at the society and community level, you have imposing curfews. For child abuse, for the individual, you have promoting parenting skills, and for the society community, you have mandatory reporting. For sexual violence, at the individual level, you have rape prevention classes, and at the society community level, you have restricting opportunities. Societal level approaches. Every society is under an obligation to offer its members the best possible protection against aggression and violence. Evidence that levels of aggression and violence vary between societies, to the extent that they endorse peace-promoting norms and values and support nonviolent forms of bringing about social change, is discussed by Anwar et al. 2017. Despite the fact that aggressive behavior must ultimately be changed at the level of the individual aggressor, societal norms and practices can have a profound effect on the scale of aggression displayed by individual members. The issue of alcohol as a risk factor for aggressive behavior is a case in point. See also Chapter 5. In a study conducted in Australia, Menendez et al. 2017 compared rates of violence in two entertainment areas of Sydney 5 years before and 5 years after the introduction of legislation containing various measures to restrict the sale of alcohol. Moreover, they examined changes in adjacent areas to test the possibility that a decrease in the targeted areas might be offset by an increase in violence in neighboring parts of the city. The critical dependent measure was the count of police-recorded incidents of non-domestic violence. The rate of violent incidents was reduced by 27% across the two areas where the legislation came into force, and no evidence was found for an increase in violence rates in adjacent parts of the city. However, as the authors note, other factors may have contributed to this outcome. For example, the fact that the legislation was introduced following fatal attacks that had received widespread publicity. As a result, fewer people may have visited the area in the period following the tightening of the law. This example illustrates both the potential for society-level measures to reduce aggression and violence and the challenges involved in evaluating their causal effects. A general approach towards prevention at the societal level is to reduce opportunities for carrying out aggressive behaviors through influencing the social and physical environment to make it harder for aggressors to carry out their intentions to harm. Goldstein, 1994. Examples of measures implemented at the societal or community level to reduce opportunities for aggression are presented in Table 12.2. For example, tightening security controls at airports worldwide was introduced in the wake of the 9/11 attacks to stop terrorists from carrying weapons and explosives on board planes. In the UK, one measure designed to reduce aggressive and antisocial behavior at the community level is the implementation of legislation that gives police officers the right to disperse groups who they reasonably believe have intimidated, harassed, alarmed, or distressed any members of the public through their presence or behavior. Antisocial Behavior Act 2003, Section 30. Table 12.2. Examples of societal measures for reducing opportunities for aggressive behavior. Airport security controls, alcohol bans in public, designated women's spaces in public car parks, dispersal zones for curbing antisocial behavior, gun control measures, restraining orders for stalkers or violent partners, neighborhood watch schemes, strategic seating areas separating fan groups at sports events, and surveillance cameras in public places. As indicated by the Australian example of legislation to control access to alcohol, a central way in which societies seek to prevent and control aggressive behavior is by means of legal regulations. The law is used to enforce adherence to social norms, not only by punishing individual lawbreakers, but also by deterring future perpetrators from committing acts of aggression. The World Health Organization conducted a worldwide review of legal measures designed to reduce different forms of violence and found that there was a substantial variation in how responsive countries were in recognizing the need for legal regulations, as illustrated in Figure 12.1. World Health Organization, 2014. Figure 12.1. Proportion of countries with laws to prevent violence and the extent to which countries report these laws as being fully enforced. N equals 133 reporting countries. So the list of laws is against statutory rape, against rape, forced sexual intercourse, against contact sexual violence without rape, against non-contact sexual violence, domestic family violence legislation, against weapons on school premises, against gang or criminal membership, allowing removal of violent spouse from home, ban on corporal punishment, against rape in marriage, against elder abuse, and against elder abuse in institutions. So for each of these, you can see that the enforcement rate is from about 2/3 to about 50%. And the most common laws that most countries have are against statutory rape and contact sexual violence without rape. And the most infrequent laws are against corporal punishment, against rape in marriage, against elder abuse, and against elder abuse in institutions. The report distinguishes between the existence of legal regulations and their full enforcement, and the figure shows that for most forms of violence, only about half of the countries that have passed relevant laws fully enforce them. 2 legal measures designed to achieve a general effect on reducing aggression and violence will be discussed briefly to illustrate the potential and limitations of this approach: capital punishment and gun control legislation. Legal regulations addressing specific forms of aggression, such as corporal punishment of children or intimate partner violence, will be discussed later in this chapter. Capital punishment. Whether or not legal sanctions have a deterrent effect on violence can be assessed with respect to the effectiveness of capital punishment. Deterrence theory assumes that preventing crime requires the development of a system of punishment that will teach the lesson that crime does not pay. It presupposes that criminal acts are preceded by a rational decision-making process in which the potential offender weighs the presumed benefits of the criminal act against the cost of punishment. With few exceptions, studies that have examined the deterrent effect of capital punishment on homicides are limited to the U.S. as the only Western nation still carrying out the death penalty. The number of death penalties executed in the U.S. decreased continuously over the last 20 years, from 279 in 1999 to 34 in 2019. No solid data and research are currently available from countries with the highest rates of death penalty executions, such as China and Iran, but a comprehensive report on the state of capital punishment worldwide is provided by Amnesty International, 2019. Deterrence theory. Theory that preventing crime requires the development of a system of punishment that will teach the lesson that crime does not pay. 2 main strategies have been employed to assess the deterrence potential of capital punishment: comparing homicide rates between U.S. states with and without capital punishment, and comparing homicide rates before and after the abolition of capital punishment within a state. Findings from both paradigms have disconfirmed the deterrence hypothesis by failing to provide evidence of lower homicide rates in states with capital punishment and increases in states that have abolished capital punishment. However, as noted by Land et al. 2009, any inferences are fragile, given the small number of executions in many of the jurisdictions. Focusing on Texas as a state with a comparatively high execution rate, these authors found a small short-term dip in the number of homicides following executions, but this was followed by an increase in the subsequent months. A later review by ch12 et al. 2013 also concluded that the empirical basis for evaluating the deterrence hypothesis of capital punishment is weak. Many problems lie in the correlational nature of data looking for the covariation of death penalty executions and murder rates over time, which may be driven by a range of third variables or open to the reverse interpretation that an increase in murder rates leads to a stricter stance toward executing death penalties. Further disconfirmation of the deterrence hypothesis comes from findings showing that neither the certainty nor the speed with which the death penalty was imposed was related to homicide rates. Even when enforced swiftly and with high certainty, capital punishment failed to act as a deterrent against future crimes. This was true for different types of murder, including police killings and homicides committed by female perpetrators. Critics have also proposed that rather than acting as a deterrent to homicide, the death penalty may have a brutalizing effect, increasing homicide rates, by suggesting that it is appropriate to kill others against whom one has a grievance. There is some support for the brutalization hypothesis in the evidence reviewed by Land et al. 2009. Bailey and Peterson, 1999, concluded that policymakers would do well to consider means other than capital punishment to significantly reduce the rate of homicide in the United States. More recent evidence reviewed above has confirmed this conclusion. The findings also send a clear message to those countries that have abolished capital punishment, but in which public opinion regularly calls for its reintroduction following high-profile murder cases. Gun control legislation. As we saw in Chapter 5, there is consistent evidence for a link between gun ownership rates and rates of violent crime. Therefore, reducing ownership rates and restricting access to firearms may be considered as potentially effective strategies for preventing firearm-related deaths and injuries. Whether or not reducing access to firearms would bring down homicide rates has been a controversial issue, as illustrated, for example, by Michael Moore's well-known film Bowling for Columbine, 2002. It has been argued that restricting access to firearms might not only be ineffective, but could in fact increase violence by limiting citizens' right and ability to defend themselves. Isolating the effects of gun control legislation from the complex network of variables associated with the role of firearms, particularly in American society, is a difficult task. Worldwide reviews have shown substantial positive correlations between rates of gun ownership and violent crime. For example, a study that included 26 high-income countries yielded a substantial correlation in the region of R equals 0.70 between rates of gun ownership and rates of homicide, indicating that about 50% of the variance in homicide rates can be attributed to variations in the prevalence of firearms. Hemingway and Miller, 2000. However, such correlational analyses suffer from the problem that gun ownership rates could be the consequence rather than the cause of homicide, and both firearm prevalence and homicide could be driven by other variables, such as cultural norms about violence, so that they do not necessarily suggest that reducing the availability of firearms would bring down homicide rates. Vigdor and Mercy, 2006, examined changes in intimate partner homicide in different U.S. states contingent upon the introduction of legal regulations restricting access to firearms for perpetrators of intimate partner violence. They found that intimate partner homicides, especially those with female victims, decreased after states had passed such laws. Another study found that intimate partner homicide rates were 50% lower in states that required a waiting period of up to a week before a firearm is issued, which may allow the aggressors to cool off in the interim. Roberts, 2009. However, other studies failed to find a decrease in homicide rates after the introduction of tighter gun control laws. Looking at specific gun control measures, introducing a waiting period between application and provision of a firearm was found to be significantly associated with a decrease in gun-related homicides, whereas introducing a ban on the buying and carrying of guns by young people aged 18 to 20 years was found to be unrelated to homicide rates. In addition to implementing tighter regulations for buying and carrying a gun, several countries have introduced so-called gun buyback policies that encourage owners to return their guns. Isolating the effect of this particular measure on homicide rates is difficult, but there is some evidence that it may be linked to a reduction in violent crime. Overall, studies have presented an inconclusive picture of the effectiveness of tightening gun control legislation as a strategy for reducing gun-related violence. One problem with these studies is that a large number of weapons are not registered, undermining the reliable estimation of rates of gun ownership. Moreover, the evidence is almost exclusively quasi-experimental, comparing rates before and after the introduction of legal measures or rates between countries differing in gun control laws. This means that a host of additional factors may have differed between time points as well as countries that may be related to gun ownership rates, homicide rates, or both. The same challenges apply to other societal-level measures for preventing aggression, requiring sophisticated evaluation designs that include proper control for possible covariates.